Hello, and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the morning shot of Scottish Buckfast that gets you out of bed and gets everything you need to know for the day ahead on the election campaign trail.
Hello there, my name is Sam Coates of Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and we're on day 33 of the campaign.
Day 33? Oh my God, it's been going on forever.
It's the final clear week of campaigning, however, meaning there are just 10 days left until polling day.
Now, the exciting news from my Zoom screen, Sam, is that there are no beige hotel walls around you, but this is definitely not your house. These are beautiful, famous arches. You're outdoors. I can see plants. I can see a gorgeous Victorian Gothic roof. You're at St Pancras Station, aren't you?
I am. I'm in the hotel lobby next to St Pancras Station, where they very kindly let me in before they open and provided me with free coffee in order to record this podcast, because I am on the election campaign trail with Keir Starmer today, who is visiting a school in the East Midlands. Jack, what three things are we going to talk about today?
Well, with 10 days to go, Sam, we're going to talk about how things are getting ugly on the campaign trail, and this is going to get played out on our TV screens, or I should say our YouTube screens. This evening, Keir and Rishi are going back-to-back on Sun TV, and they're going to be rowing about gambling, about trans issues, and about their various made-up claims about each other's tax policies. So we'll be watching some pretty ugly telly tonight. Secondly, we're going to be talking about Nigel Farage, who's managed to get himself into a row involving Vladimir Putin, which is also quite ugly. And then we're going to cleanse ourselves by talking about the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who are going to tell everyone how terrible both of these parties' manifestos are at a big event in London this morning.
It's a sort of weird point in this election campaign. Somebody wise in Tory world who I was talking to last night was saying, well, I suppose they were bemoaning really, that we're in the campaign equivalent of the silly season, because there are no big announcements left. All the manifestos are done. We've got one head-to-head TV debate, and that's on Wednesday. And so if something actually newsworthy happens, it lasts for days and days. But it does feel a bit weird, that the sort of almost upside-down election campaign. Anyway, let's get on with the main stuff. Jack, do you want to start off by talking about what today's all about?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about something that happens and lasts for days to days. Well, this gambling scandal that's engulfed the Tory campaign is certainly doing that. And it's amazing, really, if you think, Sam, the D-Day row in the early part of their campaign lasted more than a week and sucked all the oxygen out of the Tory attack lines for at least a week. And now this betting scandal is doing exactly the same thing to them. Here we are talking about this on day 5 or whatever it's been since it was first revealed by The Guardian, and it's still going on, and we're getting more and more information. We know now, thanks to the Sunday Times, that a third person in Rishi Sunak's inner circle is being investigated, as well as that police protection officer who appears to be embroiled in it as well. There is more revelations in the papers this morning. The investigation is ongoing. Rishi Sunak is saying that he's not going to take any action against anyone until that investigation has finished by the Gambling Commission. What's the latest you're hearing, Sam, about where this is headed?
Well, I've been talking to people inside the gambling industry, and they've given a pretty comprehensive account of where we are and where they think this story is and isn't going. So what's happened is that ever since the first revelation about Craig Williams, Rishi Sunak's top parliamentary aide, putting a bet, which he's admitted to on the date of the general election, gambling operators, all of them, all the sort of bookies, were asked to provide a spreadsheet of all the political bets that were taken in the months of May and June if the bet was going to win the person who placed it more than £199, right? So that's all political bets have had to be sent in a spreadsheet from all the companies to the Gambling Commission, the regulator. It doesn't matter how much the stake was, the sort of cut-off is how much was due to be won. Now, this spreadsheet, if you add up all the spreadsheets of all the gambling companies, actually is only a few hundred bets. So it's actually less than I expected. That's not a few hundred bets taken by people who were involved with the election. That's a few hundred bets by anybody in the UK. It's a very niche market, said one. And so almost immediately, the Gambling Commission, like the individual companies, will have been able to go down that list and spot any notable names, so like the names of MPs. And what the companies think is going on is that the Gambling Commission has probably already done that. So there is a feeling in the gambling companies that that there probably aren't more big names to come, because any big names would already have been notified, and one way or another, those names might have come out into the into the public domain. And there is also a scepticism amongst some of the people that there are any more big names anyway to come out. We will see whether that's true. Their claims might be proved wrong within hours. But what's going on now is the Gambling Commission is sort of looking at this list for a second time to see if they can trace any names on the list that have links to individuals who might have known the election date in advance. And so it's sort of looking at people's LinkedIns and their social media profiles and their Facebooks to see if they were married to or best friends with somebody who worked in CCHQ or in the inner core of the cabinet, to see if that throws up anything. That's a more complicated task. But the other kind of bit of intel that they have is that they don't think, the industry doesn't think, that anybody who is found guilty of this is going to get anything like the maximum punishment, so prison, because you can be in prison for up to 2 years for this, or even fined. They think that the Gambling Commission is much more likely to issue a slap on the wrist. Obviously, a policeman has been arrested. However, as far as the MPs and the officials are concerned, the industry itself doesn't expect a particularly big punishment for those caught up, although I do wonder if prosecutors get involved, given the high profile of the case, whether that ends up being true. That's the backdrop. That would suggest that we're perhaps over the cusp of the worst of this story for the Tories, but my goodness, that could be proved wrong within hours.
Yeah, and even if it's not proved wrong, Sam, and you're right that this doesn't lead to any like serious criminal charges or anything like that, just the amount of oxygen it sucked out of the campaign and the clear attack line it gives Labour on this, and I think you'll be hearing about this for weeks and weeks after the election. Labour aren't going to stop going on about this. They were gambling on our future and trying to make money and all the rest of it. It's such an easy thing for people to understand, as we've been saying. You'll see it again on this YouTube show tonight. Just watch how much pressure Rishi Sunak comes under over this. He has decided not to take action against any of the people. Yeah, and I thought your colleague Trevor Phillips absolutely nailed it yesterday when he was interviewing James Cleverly on his Sunday show and just said to him, any normal boss would just haul you in and say, did you do it? And if you did it, you're out. And Rishi Sunak's chosen not to do that. And if you read the papers today, you'll see a lot of grumbling and unhappiness from Tory candidates, former Tory MPs, who were saying the Prime Minister should be much more decisive to put some real distance between himself and these allegations. And his decision not to do that has allowed it to fester and continue throughout this campaign. And as I say, we'll be hearing more of it today. The other thing we'll definitely be hearing the Prime Minister coming under pressure on the Sun show tonight, Sam, I'm sure, will be small boats, an issue very close to that newspaper's heart and its readers' hearts. And with wonderful timing, I read in Playbook this morning that the 50,000th small boat arrival will arrive today. In the UK, or that's the expectation, which gives the easiest attack line to Labour on this that you could possibly imagine. And again, I think Rishi Sunak will come under a lot of pressure on that. However, Keir Starmer is going to come under pressure too. Labour Party sort of changing policy on its stance on trans issues today. Have you managed to get your head around exactly the tweak in Labour policy on this that we're seeing on the front page of the Times?
The Times reports that Labour wants to make the process of changing gender simpler, or in their words, remove indignities for trans people who deserve recognition and acceptance. And that really amounts to three things, and Labour are confirming that this morning. Now, it's quite techie, it's quite in the weeds, but it matters enormously to a lot of people. Those three things are, instead of there being people who want to change gender being required to prove that they have spent 2 years in the new gender, instead that will be changed to a 2-year cooling off period before it's approved. Labour say that it was always a nonsense to provide proof of 2 years in a gender. They will drop the panel of doctors and lawyers that approve gender recognition certificates and reduce from 2 to 1 the number of doctors needed, and there will now not be needed permission from a spouse. So that sounds like it makes the process, in Labour's phrase, removes indignities. In the view of some, it makes it slightly easier. This all plays into a very high-octane debate about whether Labour are doing enough to protect biological women who are concerned that people who transition have access to female-only spaces. There was a blistering attack by J.K. Rowling, who has donated to Labour in the past, in Saturday's Times, who said that Labour and Keir Starmer are often offensive towards women fighting to retain their rights. The Times leader weighs in on this morning, saying that Keir Starmer isn't clearly doing enough to protect women's spaces. And it is an issue, I think, that, particularly post the J.K. Rowling attack, the Tories can spy electoral advantage on, but also quite clearly matters to a lot of people.
Yeah, you're completely right. Hugely important issue, but one that's part of a very toxic debate, or the way that people frame the arguments, and Labour starting to find themselves dragged into that 10 days before polling day is definitely not where they would have wanted to be. The Tories were piling in really hard last night, briefing very, very hard against certain members of the Labour shadow cabinet, casting aspersions about their views on this without really any way of backing it up, and trying to just create a lot of noise around this, because they know that if they're talking about this issue a few days before polling day, that's basically not where Labour want to be. So they will try and go at that again and again and again today. And so that's one to watch. The other one we should be watching is Nigel Farage. The other row that is now onto its third day follows Nigel Farage's interview on Panorama on Friday night. We thought that might spring up in Newsline, and indeed it did. Nick Robinson got him to speak quite strongly about the war in Ukraine. Nigel Farage has said some of this stuff before, but he's not backing down from it, saying that NATO provoked Vladimir Putin. It's not a popular line. Nigel Farage says a lot of things that appear to chime with the British public. Safe to say this ain't one of them. And both Tories and the Labour know that, which is why we saw them all piling in all over the weekend, trying to, describing him as all sorts of things, saying he's basically sympathetic to Putin's point of view, which he insists is not true. But it's a very, very different language than we hear from any other mainstream politician on this issue. And that's why the Tories are going to carry on banging on about this today, because they think this is one issue where Nigel Farage is not in tune with the British public, and they can actually create a wedge between him and some of those switching Tory voters who are heading over to reform in their droves.
I think the interview with Harry Horton on ITV this evening is quite important, because there are two elements to it. First of all, he says that the Ukraine war's at a stalemate, and then he says that the conclusion is from that it is better to have negotiations about it than not. And I think it's important to explain why this isn't, this might sound like a common sense position from Nigel Farage, because I don't think anyone would dispute the Ukraine war is in a very difficult position. But you've got to remember, Nigel Farage wants to be Prime Minister. And if the Prime Minister thinks that a conflict is in stalemate, then they are unlikely to be doing what the British state is doing at the moment, which is giving $3 billion alone this year to assist a war, because the Prime Minister, the consequence of thinking a war is in stalemate would not be to give assistance on that scale. So I think that implies Nigel Farage, if he was Prime Minister, which is the job he wants, would change strategy. The interview also suggests that Nigel Farage opposes parts of NATO's strategy to expand eastward, because he thinks that provokes Vladimir Putin. So Britain, under a theoretical Nigel Farage future, would be in conflict with that element of NATO's policy. So I think it is very significant. You've got Boris Johnson weighing in on this today. You've got some Tory candidates for the leadership after the election, if the Tories lose, which looks likely, backing away from saying that Nigel Farage should be admitted. I think Robert Jenrick is the last one in the last few days to be doing that, suggesting he should remain on the outside of the party. So I think there is a sort of shift even amongst the right of the Tory party in their attitudes to Farage, and I think this new strand, this narrative has accelerated that.
I totally agree, and very interesting to see Boris Johnson coming out against him today. You were saying on the podcast last week, Sam, how Boris Johnson had sort of shifted his own stance on Farage and had moved from a sort of maybe we could accommodate this guy in a sort of Boris Farage dream team to something very different. Only Boris Johnson, can save the Tories from Nigel Farage, and he seems to be following that up with this attack on Nigel Farage today. And you do wonder if the Tories have found their wedge issue. You know, can they keep this going? Can they use this to turn voters off Nigel Farage after the initial sort of rush of support when he entered the election? They might have just got their fingers onto something that they can cling on to. Let's talk about the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Sam, the most respected economic think tank in the country, has a press conference this morning and will be unveiling a big report, basically giving its verdict on the two main parties' manifestos. And I think it's safe to say they're not going to be kind. Like having crunched the numbers and been through the policies of both parties, they are not going to say that this is a wonderfully informative sets of plans that are going to save the country from its current political problems. Far from it. They are going to be absolutely scathing about both of them, essentially say a plague on both of your houses. Nobody is addressing the massive public service problem that we've got headed down the tracks, with austerity baked in, with demographic change putting more pressure on public services, an urgent need for more funding, and nobody addressing that at all.
They've identified a con, which is in the various manifestos, the Tory and Labour manifestos do cherry pick areas of additional spending that both parties promise, but they say on top of what baseline, top of what starting point, that's entirely unclear. And when it comes to the health budget, for instance, depending on what baseline you use, the different plausible paths of spending could be more than 20 times the kind of £1 billion gap between the two parties. On the defence budget, you know, we could end up spending 75 billion more a year or 24 billion more a year under the Tory plans. You just don't know, and different paths have been suggested at different points. They throw their hands up in the air. The problem is they've been saying something similar all the way through the election campaign, and for various reasons it just hasn't made much of a difference. It's an interesting question why the biggest issues around our economy and public spending haven't played a bigger role in this election campaign. Maybe it's the media's fault, maybe it's politicians' fault, maybe it's collectively the nation's fault for not pressing it more, but it just hasn't. And so I think the budgets and the spending reviews that come the other side of this election will feel like a bit of a surprise, because the issues about them haven't been properly kicked around ahead of July the 4th.
And I think that's very much in Labour's interest for it to be that way, assuming they do win the election, because it allows them to, quote unquote, open the books on day one, look at the state of the public finances and say, oh my goodness, we had no idea it was all so terrible. I'm afraid we're going to have to do X, Y and Z terrible things that we were unable to mention before the election. And I think we should all probably be braced for something quite grim along those lines this autumn, assuming that Labour do win. Not that the Tories will be in any different position were they to win either, of course. Sam, you'd better go and catch your train, hadn't you? Where exactly are you heading? You're allowed to tell us.
East Midlands for an event in a school with Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting. There's lots of other things going on today. DUP manifesto launch, Rishi Sunak's launching the Tory Scottish election campaign, and so bits around the country, but Keir Starmer in the Midlands before that Sun event. So it's a day trip. I'll be back probably from home to speak to you tomorrow.
I'll look forward to it. Have a great day out, Sam.
And you. Cheers.